Hi and welcome to the Lightleaders, a podcast for lightworkers and conscious entrepreneurs who are passionate about raising the consciousness of our planet and take action to make it happen. I'm your host, Alexis Lember, and I believe that we are currently in the middle of a global awakening of humanity, that right now is the time for heart-centered conscious people to step into our power so we can replace the old paradigm and bring the conscious new earth into manifestation. So here, I'll interview a variety of people who lead this movement of creating this new earth, whether they do it through a meditation course, a conscious podcast, or an ethical cryptocurrency. I call them light leaders. If you resonate with our mission, please help us spread the message by sharing this podcast. We're having more and more content getting censored, so we need your help. Make sure to stay in touch also by registering to our newsletter on thelightleaders.org. If you hear little nuggets you love and you'd like to share, screenshot this episode and share on your Instagram stories, make sure to tag us at the Lightleaders podcast and we will repost. Hi and welcome to this new episode. I have a short disclaimer, which is that in this episode with Gary Cousin on the astrology of Bitcoin, it was super interesting and we went quite technical, looking at birth chart of Bitcoins and going more into details. So because I value your time, I want to make sure that's what's of interest. At the beginning, we're more general and then we dive more into specifically the astrology of Bitcoin and different events that have happened. That being said, enjoy the episode if you choose to watch the whole episode. Hey, there's a project I'm super passionate about. It's called the Lightleaders Mastermind. We're looking for people who really want to create better systems for the new Earth and see blockchain, cryptocurrencies, and decentralized technologies as a great way to do it. More concretely, we'll have a few mastermind events with top guest speakers, and we'll create a group of like-minded people to build those new foundations. We want people who are passionate about the values around sovereignty and freedom and who are also capable and solution-driven. So if that sounds like you, I invite you to get more information on thelightleaders.org/mastermind. We also have a free Telegram group that you'll find there where you can get more info. Hi and welcome to this new episode of The Light Leaders. Today I'm with Gary Cousin. Gary has an engineering and IT career background. He's a practitioner of astrology, having dived into that rabbit hole about 27 years ago. He's passionate about the application of quantum physics, philosophy, and its impact on our consciousness to create the new world. Having first discovered Bitcoin in 2012, he quickly realized that this new form of money would ultimately transform the world. Gary, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Alex. Good to be here, yeah.
I'm very curious. I'm in your Telegram group about the astrology of Bitcoin, and that's what we're going to talk about. I have a little bit of skepticism, but also a lot of curiosity and openness to it. So I'm super happy to have you.
Yeah.
And my first question to you will be, what are you grateful for today?
I'm grateful to be living in Bali and grateful that we are on the brink, I do believe, of a radical transformation of this planet, of this world, of our society, of the global economy. You know, I think in 10 years from now, we will not recognize this planet, all the changes that are coming. Quantum computers is a real pet subject of mine. I mean, we think the world changed through computers. Wait until quantum computers truly birth onto this planet. Artificial intelligence, just understandings of like human consciousness. I think we're living in incredible times.
We do. Thanks, Gary. I'd love to give a bit of background to the listener about what's your vision for the world, your why, and also how what you do, your actions, help bring that into manifestation.
So I've always been passionate about sort of how technology can change the world. And I remember years ago, I saw this incredible piece of like technology convergence when the internet was available on the cell phone. And that just like suddenly, wow, birthed a whole new kind of revolution. And then when I discovered cryptocurrency and Bitcoin, and when one really understands the fundamental difference between money as it's created out of thin air, fiat money, and decentralized financial systems of Bitcoin, like another light went off. And just like the internet was the beginning of a massive revolution, cryptocurrency is another massive revolution. And I'm like passionate about what technology can do to bring about a new economic system. Because fundamentally, how are we going to change the world? Money makes the world go round. And until we change the monetary system and the way money is created and the way money is distributed, we're not going to see fundamental change in the world. So my passion is like to bring about a new understanding of how we can change the world using technology, using cryptocurrency, using a new economic system, or creating a new economic system.
Yeah, totally aligned with that.
Yeah.
Also, you're so in the vibe of this podcast because a lot of like the listeners would be in the spiritual conscious sphere, and a lot also into business embodiment of that and cryptos. And so what a better topic than the astrology of the Bitcoin.
Yeah. So, I mean, it might even seem like a bit of a strange mix. Like people might think astrology, Bitcoin, like how do those two come together?
Because I actually do workshop for beginners for cryptos, and almost all our audience, probably based on my relationships and connections, are yoga teachers and people into more consciousness and spirituality.
Right.
And there's that bridge to make between the nerdy cryptocurrency space and the more consciousness and spirituality, but it's there.
Yeah, so maybe let me just give a little kind of like how do we go from astrology to Bitcoin and how do the two link together? Astrology is what most people understand about astrology. It's based upon the positions of the planets and the stars at the moment you're born. You have, everyone's familiar with their birth chart, or not maybe their birth chart, but everybody's familiar, like you're a Sagittarius, you're a Capricorn, you're a Cancerian, you're Gemini, where the sun was at the moment you were born. An astrology chart is a lot more complicated than just the sun sign. So a lot of people may be familiar with astrology reading in magazines and newspapers, the sun sign column. That's very simplistic astrology. And astrology, as we know it today, is multifaceted. There's many, many different, like, let's say, types of astrology. But fundamentally, I mean, astrology goes back, in its form, its true astrology goes back about 2,000 years. And it kind of went up and down through the Dark Ages. It was held together by the medieval Arab, and it peaked in the sort of 900 AD, and it developed. And there's fundamentally 4 types of astrology. Most people only really are familiar with what's called birth chart or natal astrology, natal as in being born. And that's kind of looking at what's happening with your character and what's happening to events in your life. Then there's a second kind of astrology, which is called mundane astrology, and it's the astrology of global affairs, of weather patterns, predicting weather, predicting prices of stocks and crops. And then there's 2 other areas of astrology, one of them which I particularly specialize in. It's called questioning astrology, and it's the astrology of the present moment, the now, where you can ask a question, and this question can be anything to like, I'm in a court case. Will I win this court case? I've lost my cell phone. Where do I find it? I'm about to invest. Is this a good investment decision? I've met somebody. Will this relationship turn into something meaningful? So any kind of question can be answered. And it's the time that question is asked of me, the astrologer, you draw up a chart at that moment. And then there's a correlation to that. And it's like looking forward into the future and saying, I want to launch a business. I want to publish a website. What's the best time for me to do that activity? What's a good date for me to get married? And it's all based upon the premise that, and this is the fundamental of astrology, that there's a correlation between the positions of the planets in the sky and human activity on Earth. Now, it's very important to understand that it's correlation, not causation. So a lot of scientific viewpoints poo-poo astrology because they're looking at the world through cause and effect. So much of the scientific model is based upon this cause and effect. And when we really start deep delving into the spiritual realms and ultimately into the quantum realms, we live in an interconnected universe which is beyond kind of cause and effect. You know, like quantum computers and what's called quantum correlation is that you can have particles that split apart, that can be kilometers apart or tens of light years apart. You change the one particle spin and the other one changes simultaneously with no time, no signal. So they're interconnected. There's this interconnection of all life. And that's really the premise of astrology. So with that kind of understanding, what becomes fascinating is that when something new comes into being, such as Bitcoin came into being on the let me just get it right, the 3rd of January 2009 at 6:15 in the evening UK time, the first blockchain was created of Bitcoin. So we have exact time stamp. So we have literally a birth chart of Bitcoin, and we can actually look at that birth chart and we can start making get some sense of what is Bitcoin all about. And then what's fascinating about astrology, because we can look at a specific time, we can also look into the future, and we can look into the past, and we can say, in the past, the planets were in certain position and were making a correlative effect or relationship to the Bitcoin chart. And then we can go to the pricing tables of Bitcoin and we can see interesting correlations.
And actually, for the people who watch the video, at some point we'll get some slides that you prepared. Right. So
yeah, and I'll talk through the slides for those that are not, on video. But so what's fascinating for me is that there's a number of long planetary movements that have been in effect. And as these planets move and change, particularly as they change star signs, we see correlative changes in human activity. For example, in 1989, the unthinkable happened. Communism fell, the Berlin Wall fell, apartheid in South Africa, where I'm from, fell. Everything was this massive change across the planet. And if you look at the global astrology at the time, you'll see a very specific coming together of two planets. And similarly, now in December 21st, 2020, there was a coming together of Jupiter and Saturn. And Jupiter and Saturn only come together every 20 years. And these coming together of Jupiter and Saturn have been studied by astrologers for literally 2,000 years. And they've observed that when these planets come together, there's a fundamental change in the sort of zeitgeist or the actual affairs of human society. So, already in 2018, 19, even before, astrologers were looking at 2020 and saying there's going to be a global shift. We don't know what exactly it is, but we get some ideas because It's the first time that Jupiter and Saturn came together in 200 years in an air sign of Aquarius. So something to do with air, a shift there. What did we have? We had Corona come to the planet to do with breathing. We had the Black Lives Matter event, which was fundamentally started with George Floyd being killed, saying, I can't breathe, I can't breathe. So we had the symbolism of air, and we know we're in a fundamental shift. So astrology looks at these correlations. And what became really interesting is that in 2008, we had the global financial crisis. At the same time, what happened in 2008, the Bitcoin white paper was published. And the Bitcoin white paper spoke of a fundamental new way of conducting currency, finance, transacting. It was a total shift of money that was not controlled by any one centralized point. So, I mean, currently, as you know, money is created out of thin air by the Federal Reserve, by central banks, and it kind of trickles down, and the people at the top get lots of it, and gets down to the bottom, and the poor at the bottom get almost none of it. And our whole society is based upon this model of financial exchange. Bitcoin came along in 2009 when the first blockchain was created. The first Bitcoin was created on the blockchain, and no one knew about it. But it was a fundamental shift. People could download the Bitcoin application to their computer, and they could partake in the authentication of Bitcoin transactions and got rewarded with Bitcoins. And over time, as you know, suddenly people started realizing there's something unique about Bitcoin. And people said, I want some Bitcoin. And that created Bitcoin exchanges where people exchanged their fiat currency for Bitcoin. And there were the miners who, and as it became more and more popular, it became more and more difficult to mine Bitcoin. You suddenly couldn't mine it on your computer any longer. You had to then have big server farms, and which is what we currently have right now, these massive server farms. But it's such a fundamental shift that anybody potentially was able to enter into the creation of money, which is like a whole flip around, like not the elite at the top printing money, but anybody potentially. Like I have a Bitcoin mining server. I'm part of a mining pool, and I invested some dollars, and I'm part of a big pool, and I get rewarded. So every month while I'm sleeping, money is being created and being paid to me in Bitcoin. I mean, that's like such a incredible...
Creating money was one of the worst crime for centuries.
Totally. And so what became fascinating to me as an astrologer was that in 2008, the planet Pluto, now Pluto takes 246 years to go around the sun. And it's an extremely slow-moving planet. And Pluto, now what's interesting is that all the planets were named based upon the name of mythology from Greek mythology, and there was kind of no coincidence as to why they were named that way. And interesting, Pluto was discovered in 1930 as mankind was learning to split the atom and use plutonium to create the atomic bomb, which totally transformed our society. Suddenly we went from a species where we now had the technology to totally wipe out our existence. And that's essentially, I'll keep it simple, the fundamental astrological meaning of Pluto. Pluto brings about total transformation. In 2008, as the financial crisis was happening, as the Bitcoin white paper gets published, the planet Pluto changed. After traveling through Sagittarius for about 15 years, it moved into Capricorn. Capricorn in astrology is the zodiac sign that represents the global economy. So suddenly we have the simple astrology. total transformation energy coming into global economy. And now we're in this 15-odd year journey from about 2008 to 2023, 24. So Pluto's right at the end now of Capricorn. And we're seeing something that started out of nowhere, 2008, 2009, to now becoming, people are saying that Bitcoin is a major hedge against dollar inflation and keeping value. And we're seeing it. Massive corporates are investing billions of dollars into Bitcoin. People predict that Bitcoin is going to be hundreds of thousands, maybe even $1 million a Bitcoin. So we in this total change of the fundamentals of an economic system. And yeah, there's a lot of resistance. I mean, the IMF and various people are saying, it's just a bubble, it's just going to go away. But they fundamentally don't understand, or they know it, they just can't get... it's like the internet. Once the internet was created, it couldn't be censored. The whole design of the internet was such that it could never be censored. And similarly with Bitcoin, it's people now fundamentally can have value, money that they own that can never be taken away from them. I mean, we had situations in Venezuela where the government just overnight said, we're taking away 30% of the value of the currency, and overnight people just lost millions. And this is what can happen. I mean, and
pretty likely even.
Pretty likely. Many people, many billionaires are saying the dollar is going to collapse. How that's going to happen? And the astrology is very interesting because we can start looking at the astrology of the United States chart. So the United States was formed on the 4th of July, 1776. So we have an astrological chart. And what's super fascinating is that 246 years ago, Pluto has moved from the foundation of the United States, and it's doing what's called a planetary return. Next year, Pluto will return. So 246 years after 1776 takes us to 2023. So the United States, at an astrological chart level, is about to undergo a total rebirth, a fundamental rebirth. And then it becomes super fascinating if you start looking at like the chart of the Bitcoin, and the fundamental of anyone's chart is the sun sign. Now, the sun sign of the Bitcoin chart is the sun sitting at 13 degrees of Capricorn. So in the sign of global finance, we find the sun. The sun in astrology, if you look at any astrological textbook, go back 2,000 years, you'll see the sun is the equivalent symbolic of gold. So the Bitcoin chart, and for the moment the Bitcoin chart Bitcoin was created, we have a Leo rising chart. If you set the chart for London, or I have a chart set for Dublin, but London as the global financial center, we have a Leo rising chart. In astrology, every star sign is ruled by a planet. Leo is the sign of the sun, ruled by the sun. So the fundamental of this chart is a symbolism of gold. So this is like everyone's saying, it is the new gold.
It's interesting also what you say about the US, because I was pondering recently how First and Second Amendment, they're more in jeopardy now. First Amendment with a lot of censorship we see. Even second, and I was reflecting on things like how important are those simple things like freedom of speech. And as a French, I've been trained more to laugh at the Second Amendment, all the Yankees with the guns. And somehow now I understand why they put it in place. It's to stand up against more oppressive governments and give more power to the people. So that's just a reflection on how you talked about this cycle coming back.
So that cycle, and if we look at, that's outside of the scope of this discussion, but the US chart, the astrology of the United States chart is super fascinating. And the astrology shows a radical, massive, total transformation coming to the United States. And then what becomes really fascinating is that the sun of, so the United States chart is on the 4th of July. If you have a birthday around 4th of July, you are a sun sign Cancerian. Cancer and Capricorn are exactly opposite one another. The United States sun in the chart is at 13 degrees of Capricorn, of Cancer. The sun of the Bitcoin chart is 13 degrees of Capricorn. They're exactly opposite one another. So what's fascinating is that the 4th of July astrology chart for the United States as a country, it's a Cancerian sun sign. And that Cancerian on the 4th of July is at 13 degrees of Cancer. The Bitcoin chart is sun sign 13 degrees of Capricorn, which makes the sun signs exactly opposite one another. And in astrology, when planets are opposite one another, they represent opposition. So literally, at some fundamental level, Bitcoin is in opposition to the fundamental of what the United States stands for, which is totally linked with the US dollar. Then it becomes even more fascinating, because if you take the birth chart for the United States dollar, is it exactly a quarter, like 90 degrees to that axis of Bitcoin. United States, we have the dollar in exactly. And then the other major currency, which we can't be ignored, is the Chinese currency. Their currency as a birth, if you look at it, is exactly opposite the US dollar. Oh. So you have a picture in the sky of Bitcoin sun, United States sun, dollar sun, Chinese currency sun at a total cross to one another. So it's like the cosmos is saying to us that these four fundamentally are at odds with one another. And why I know that Bitcoin is going to be, it's not a bubble that's going to disappear. It's going to fundamentally change the way we do the economic system, is because of the journey of Pluto through all the star signs. And I can give you many other examples of how, as Pluto enters a star sign, there's this fundamental transformation and shift in a certain activity on the planet. We're seeing a transformation of the global economy underway. And, something big and profound, fundamentally transformative to the world and the United States is coming as the United States enters what's known as their Pluto return next year. Nice. So we're living in fascinating times.
Yeah. So, and I'd love to look at what you've prepared also on the astrology and Bitcoin. I guess you studied the correlations, so it can be really interesting.
So I found it really fascinating is...
should I pull this?
Yeah, if we can maybe put up the first slide. The next one. So this is a slide of the Bitcoin price. You can see going back to kind of like 2012, 2011, no one really had heard of Bitcoin. Just a few people. And those lucky people who bought a lot of Bitcoin then are the Bitcoin millionaires of today. But in 2013, there was this, as you can see, this massive shoot up in price, and then it kind of fell down over 2014, 2015. And there was a couple of factors that came into play for the increase in price. And if we look at the kind of the next chart, and I want to show you, so it's hard to maybe point out, but basically we have the planet Pluto sitting at 9 degrees, sort of in the house number 5, that's Pluto, sitting at 9 degrees, and 9 degrees is exactly halfway between the Mars of the Bitcoin chart and the Sun of the Bitcoin chart. Now, as I said earlier, the Sun represents the symbolism of gold. So the essence, and in any astrology chart, the Sun is the essence. So here we have Pluto, the planet of transformation. So whenever Pluto comes onto a chart, in anybody's chart, it brings big transformation, and it really kind of like puts a lot of emphasis onto and like emphasizes. So this chart was actually set for the 7th of October 2013. And that's how I first heard about Bitcoin. I actually read about the Silk Road. You might be familiar with the Silk Road.
Where you could buy weed.
You could buy drugs and all kinds of things using Bitcoin. And again, let's not go into like what it really did, but it was a fundamental sense of like you could have a website which could do whatever it wanted. It could not be traced, it could not be tracked, and people could purchase with a basically anonymous currency. It was a whole libertarian concept behind the Silk Road. And we saw a massive like adoption of Bitcoin. And still to this day, you'll have the naysayers against Bitcoin say, oh, but Bitcoin's used for illegal activity. Well, the US dollar is used for a lot more illegal activity. But this chart was showing an intensification and a lot of energy coming into the Bitcoin chart symbolized by Pluto. And we saw like a massive kind of rise in the Bitcoin price. If we move to the next chart, so the next one, that there was this big peak where Bitcoin suddenly in December 2017, there was this massive rise in the Bitcoin price, and it peaked just short of $20,000 on the 11th of December 2017, and then there was a fall off. And again, if we look at the astrology, we can see fascinating correlations. And I've drawn lines in blue here. We can see at 13 degrees in the what's known as the fourth house, we have Jupiter at 13 degrees of Scorpio, I've shown it as a blue line. It's called a sextile. So in the way astrology works, you'll have correlations between the positions of the planets, which is in the outer circle, and the positions of the actual entity, which in this case is the Bitcoin chart in the center circle. So we see that Jupiter was exactly 13 degrees, and that is 60 degrees away from 13 degrees of Capricorn. That's called a sextile. Mars was exactly 1 degree of Scorpio, and the Pluto of the Bitcoin chart was at 1 degree. So we have two very powerful, what I know as planets. The Sun and Mars are both called planets in astrology. They're making this harmonious link. When we see harmonious links, we know that something good is coming in the astrology. There was a trigger with the moon making a trine 120 degrees between the moon's position. The moon moves very fast, like within a day it's moved away from the position. So we saw this peak on the 11th of December, and then things kind of ended from there. So, I remember in 2017 watching that Jupiter coming up to the sun and seeing that the price was, and knowing that the price was going to radically increase.
Do you have a good track record of predictions?
So the predictions of...
let's say a skeptical mind could think, it's easy to find correlations looking back.
Sure.
And would want more proofs of forecasts that become accurate.
Let me maybe... I work with a trader who has a crypto fund, and he's sort of testimonial to me from working with... So he started working with me in 2019. Yeah. And for the whole of 2019, he took my astrological sort of forecast and advice about Bitcoin prices. And by the end of 2019, he had achieved a 17% higher profit margin than any other fund on the platform. And he attributes that edge to the astrology.
That's actually a good idea. You have trading platforms now where a trader can offer a copy of their trades.
So this is a people can join this fund, and in a sense we are advertising it. He's an experienced trader, many years of experience, but we add the astrological, and it gives him an edge. So he adds the technical analysis. So I don't really know technical analysis myself, but I know the astrology. He adds the technical analysis, and that's been giving him an edge. So it's not 100%, like nothing in life is 100%, but we're certainly getting correlations that are definitely giving us an edge in the trading.
Do you have, it'd be interesting, I don't know how we can map the correlation with maybe charts. a little bit more directly, but I don't know how you
Yeah,
do that.
so I mean, we can move on to kind of
Just on the slide,
Yeah.
because we won't have, like, I don't want to get
Yeah,
too
yeah,
much
sure.
into the details. Maybe if there's like a couple of things you really want
Yeah,
to
yeah.
highlight.
So in maybe just one more slide, we
Yeah.
can kind of show. Let me see what was. Let's just move on to. Yeah, I mean, we saw basically now in December last year, again, we saw Bitcoin, move up massively from, sitting at like for 2000 and most 2020, it was sitting around like 6,000, 8,000, 9,000. And then suddenly there was a move. It started in December and we saw it peak, at like nearly $50,000. In fact, it went up even higher earlier this year. And again, if we look at the chart, we'll see. So there we have Jupiter and Saturn coming together. They came together for the first time in 20 years. And I knew that, when Jupiter and Saturn come together, there would be a massive fundamental shift. And they came on, you see the Jupiter of the Bitcoin chart sits at 29 degrees of Capricorn. So basically we had Saturn and Jupiter essentially coming together right on the Jupiter. So that's called a Jupiter return, which happens every 12 years. And then again, we had a trigger of the moon making a correlation to that kind of collection of the Sun, Mars, and Pluto. So again, there was an impetus of showing an increase. Now, I just wanted to end off one last example, would be a price decrease. So, we saw Bitcoin was kind of sitting around $60,000 around April, May, and then there was a massive drop-off in the price. So if we look at the 3rd of May, price drop, and the price, went down to like $30,000. We see, and I've drawn this in red lines here, we'll see Saturn on the outside there making a short red line exactly to the Sun. Saturn is the planet of restrictions in astrology. He brings kind of decreases, whereas in contrast, Jupiter brings expansion. And then simultaneously, we saw there on the opposite side, Mars sitting in Cancer. Now, when Mars is in the sign of Cancer, he's not a happy chappy and he tends to operate in quite nasty ways, exactly opposite the Mars of the Bitcoin chart. So we had the two nasties of astrology, Saturn and Mars, both hitting the chart, and we see a correlation in a big fall off in the Bitcoin price. So yeah, I'll kind of like leave it at that. I mean, we could get many more examples. But obviously what becomes interesting is, okay, it's all good and well looking back in time, Now as to what I do is obviously look forward in time and saying, okay, well, what's coming in the future? And that becomes useful and relevant for people who are trading Bitcoin.
That's in the slides too?
No, I didn't. I just really talk about a couple of maybe dates coming up, which are become interesting. Just this week alone, in fact, on my Telegram group, Crypto Astrology, I predicted that today there will be some mixed signals coming in, and we should probably start seeing a drop in the Bitcoin price. So we're seeing kind of the Bitcoin price up and down today a little bit, sitting at $47,000. But we're moving into, I predict, a bit of a down price this week. Then becomes interesting, the astrology does become tricky sometimes because certain predictions sometimes don't come through. Like we had one recently, we were all expecting the Bitcoin price to go up, and what we saw was a massive drop-off in price. And the reason given for that price was that the Chinese basically decided no more Bitcoin mining was going to take place in China, and all the Bitcoin miners had to suddenly leave China. And there was a big drop-off in price. That, at the time, should have been an increase from an astrological perspective, but there was, in fact, a decrease. But that same configuration kicked in recently, and we saw an increase in price. So There's a third time this comes again, and that's going to be in between 25 December and 30th of December of this year. So I'm predicting basically a big increase in the price. I'm seeing also between the 15th of September this year and 17th of October a possibility for probably a lot of volatility, but we're seeing the planet Uranus make what's called a trine to the sun, and the Bitcoin sun is one of the most sensitive points in this Bitcoin chart. So that should bring big increase, but because it's the planet Uranus, brings volatility. And then what becomes really interesting to me is Pluto. As I said, Pluto brings intensity and massive transformation. He's coming onto the Jupiter. Jupiter represents expansion, and when Pluto comes onto Jupiter, there's often interesting, if you look at the chart of many billionaires like Bill Gates, he's born with a Jupiter-Pluto in his chart. So it's often a signature we see of massive wealth, and where we get the word plutocracy. So there's the word Pluto coming into the English language. So we're going to have Pluto on Jupiter in March 2023, just as Pluto's about to leave and move into Aquarius after his 15-year-odd journey through Capricorn. I predict probably by 2023, we're going to see like Bitcoin transform into a whole new level of value and ways of kind of interacting with Bitcoin. So it's...
Yeah, we've seen Salvador already
exactly
looking at using it as a currency.
Totally. So, I mean, I think more and more, and with the, predicted volatility in the United States, economy and transformation in the United States, something is afoot.
Well, and that's the other question. Like, if a Bitcoin's worth $1 million, is it still going to be a lot in a few years from now?
That's a good question. I mean, for me, what becomes interesting is if we can start transacting and living within the crypto economy without having to exchange our money into fiat.
Yeah.
So,
well, that's what we're doing with, I told you about our mastermind mid-September. And what we do is you can only buy with your cryptos.
Exactly.
You can't buy with I don't want your dollars.
Totally. So, I mean, if people could start transacting in that world, then it becomes kind of irrelevant what the exchange rate is. I mean, right now, obviously, you have a lot of people just seeing Bitcoin, crypto as a way to make money. But you and I both know, and that's what the mastermind's going to be about, is like, how can we use the fundamentals of distributed finance to create a new economic system for people to kind of get out of that pyramid model of money trickles down and the poor get nothing?
Quick question on the quantum computers. Well, first, thank you for the predictions. And depending on the date of release of the podcast, people can both use it for prediction and or for looking back too, which can be interesting. With quantum computers, many people say it will be able to crack encryptions, and that could be the end of Bitcoin. What do you think about that?
So the interesting thing about quantum computers is that, yes, they will be able to crack all encryption that currently exists. So all secure socket layer SSL encryption. So when you see your browser go HTTPS for secure and the little lock, that can all be cracked by a quantum computer. But there's a whole thing called quantum encryption. So we will see the internet move to what's called the quantum internet.
Can Bitcoin move to that, or do you think it would be a different crypto?
I don't see any reason why the Bitcoin protocol couldn't be encapsulated into a quantum encryption network as well.
Because we talked about Bitcoin, but there's like Bitcoin and cryptos.
Yeah.
So the question to me is like, I have absolutely no doubt that cryptos are on the rise, and most of my portfolio is in Ether because I love Bitcoin and I love how decentralized it is, and I have a bit of doubt on how fast it can adapt.
So I guess that is a good question. But it's still a long way before we have that ubiquity of the quantum internet and quantum computers I mean, scientists know how to build a quantum computer. We absolutely know how to build that. Right now, the issue with the quantum computer is getting stable qubits, so quantum bits. I think they've managed to get like 56, but they don't last very long, and we need stability. So there's still a lot of work to be done, but it's coming.
Okay. Thank you so much, Gary. That was super interesting. I'd love you to share a bit more. Well, first, how can we follow you?
Yeah, so
Is there
I
anything
think
you want to
follow
share?
me on my Instagram at Star Magi, STARMAGI. And there's a link to my Telegram crypto astrology group. People can join for free there, where you'll see my predictions. You can ask questions around what's happening with Bitcoin. I'm starting to also look at the astrology charts of Ethereum, Cardano, Ripple, and some interesting astrology to those charts. You know, my prediction is that Ripple XRP is going to go really massive. Cardano, you know, the sky's the limit, I think. So interesting.
Yeah, XRP is a bit too centralized to my taste.
Yeah, but they seem to have a niche that's gonna, I think, be used by a lot of banking systems. But I agree, in a sense, it is a bit of it's not a pure decentralized crypto.
Thank you, Gary. I think that's super interesting and a new perspective, I feel, for people both into astrology and into Bitcoin.
Yeah.
Bridging these two. Is there anything you would share with the listener to finish?
Yeah, I think just, we're living in amazing times. And these stars show us that it's not just all random, you know, like it may seem pretty dark and gloomy right now in the world out there, but, you know, if I look forward into the astrology, we can see that there's radical change coming to humanity, and that's what inspires me. That gets me going every day.
Thank you for taking some of your precious time to listen to this podcast. If you stayed until the end, I assume it was insightful. So if you like this podcast, please share with friends. Remember that if you tag us in your Instagram story at the Lightleaders podcast, we will repost. Tell us what you've learned. You can also leave a review on your favorite podcast platform. Now, if you want to stay posted about new podcast releases, especially as we get censored more and more on big tech platforms, make sure to join our newsletter and our Telegram. You'll find the links on thelightleaders.org, and feel free to contact me directly too, whether it's for feedback or potential collaborations. Thank you again, and let's co-create the conscious new earth together.